Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Are you an Edgar Allan Poe fan? You might think you are, but you're nothing compared to the biggest Edgar Allan Poe fan in history. The man they called a Poe fiend. We'll find out who he is on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, here at the Poe Museum, we're able to meet Edgar Allan Poe fans from around the globe. There's people with Poe tattoos, there's people wearing Poe t-shirts, people who dress up as Poe. But who of us doesn't dress up as Poe from time to time? There's also Poe collectors, some of them with dozens of items, some of them with thousands of items in their personal collection. There's also people who devoted themselves to making Poe-inspired movies or music. There's all sorts of Poe fans. So what makes William Fearing Gill the greatest Poe fan of all time? The man they called a Poe fiend. Well, Gill was born in 1844, so 5 years before Edgar Allan Poe's death, so they never actually had a chance to meet each other. But he loved reading Poe's works. But then he read Poe's biography, written by Rufus W. Griswold. And Griswold had written the first biography of Poe just after Poe died. So that was the one that traveled around the globe, was reprinted, that inspired future biographies. The problem was Griswold couldn't stand Edgar Allan Poe. And in this biography, he portrayed Poe as a madman, a scoundrel, a drunk, a cheat, a liar, somebody with no morals, an awful, despicable person. And Gill said, this just can't be true. So Gill decided it was up to him to try to reclaim Poe's reputation and to write a biography that really portrayed who Poe really was. And it started out here with the book Lotus Leaves. And this was the fruit of Gill's early research into Poe's life. He wrote an essay right here called Edgar A. Poe and his biographer Rufus W. Griswold. So he had already set out to try to refute everything Griswold had written about him, especially the lies, the forgeries. Yes, Griswold actually forged letters to himself from Poe to include in his biography of Poe, saying how wonderful Griswold is, that Griswold's a great genius. Griswold wrote those letters. Anyway, Gill was also going and researching by communicating with the women in Poe's life, like Annie Richmond or Sarah Helen Whitman. He got to know and befriend these people and ask them, what was Poe like? What was he really like? Who was he as a person? And he thought this would really shape a more well-rounded depiction of Poe. The problem was, at the same time he was doing this, Poe's first English biographer, John Henry Ingram, was doing the same thing and contacting a lot of the same people. So the things they were publishing looked remarkably similar. So Gill started to accuse Ingram of plagiarizing him, and Ingram said, I've never even read your Lotus Leaves book. I'm not plagiarizing you. So they didn't really like each other too much. So in the process of Gill's research, he collected one of his pretty great Poe pieces, a piece of Poe's original coffin. Now, we did a Curator's Crypt about the Poe Museum's piece of Poe's coffin, so you have to check that out sometime. But basically, 26 years after Poe died, a lot of Poe's admirers, including William Gill, got together and had Poe moved from across the cemetery, from the back of the cemetery, an unmarked grave, to the front of the cemetery, right next to the sidewalk. And they placed a giant monument on it. It was largely crowdfunded. So it wasn't paid for by, say, the city of Baltimore or by Poe's family. It was paid for by the public who loved reading Poe's works. So as they're moving Poe across the cemetery, Gill didn't help move him. He just sort of showed up for the ceremony. It was professional coffin movers who moved him. As they were moving Poe across the cemetery, naturally the wood was rotten and waterlogged in the ground for so long. it fell apart. And Poe fell out. Gave everybody a last good scare. Now, they picked up all the Poe pieces and put them in a new Poe box and buried them in the new spot, but people grabbed chunks of the old Poe coffin off the ground. And that's how we got our piece of Poe's coffin that's on display right now in the death room. Yeah, we have a room here just called the death room. And other people had their pieces of Poe coffin made into pins for writing. And Gill had these little pieces of the coffin that he gave to Poe's former friend, Annie Richmond, the subject of Poe's poem For Annie. So they were just sort of a gift he gave to her. And she had them fashioned into a little cross that she nailed together with a nail from Poe's coffin, and she wore this cross. And eventually she gave the cross back to William Gill. We don't know what happened to it. So if you do have it in your collection, be sure to give it to the Poe Museum. This would be the perfect place for it. But anyway, a couple years after he published Lotus Leaves, he came out with a biography of Poe. And we've got a copy right here signed by the author. So this was his attempt to really change the way we perceive Poe, to really portray him as a hardworking author with an incredible imagination. And the book was a hit. It went through multiple editions. We have several editions of it right here. Just within the first few years, it was being reprinted over and over again. He was expanding it. And here's another copy of the 5th edition, just from a few years later, with the original paper spine on it. So by this time, he's going to be known as sort of a Poe fanatic. And he collected one thing that not everybody's going to get a chance to collect. He actually bought Poe's cottage in the Bronx because he loved Poe so much. He's not the only Poe collector to buy a Poe house. In the following century, Richard Gimbel, who ran a department store in Philadelphia and was a huge Poe collector, he bought the Poe house in Philadelphia that's now the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site. So if you are a really big Poe collector, you can actually buy a Poe house. But Gill went even further. Now, on the back of this copy, once again, signed by the author, there's a little note. In 1878, the writer paid a visit to the tomb of Virginia Poe at Fordham, and learning that changes were to be made in the interest of the owners of the vault, gathered the precious bones of the departed to preserve these mournful relics from imminent annihilation, in order to place them at some future time with the ashes of the poet in Baltimore. You heard that right. William Gill went to Poe's wife's grave, found out they were building over the cemetery, moving the bodies, and he personally rescued her bones, with the intention, he says, of reinterring them with her husband down in Baltimore, which took place on Poe's birthday in 1885. But if you do the math, he got the bones in 1878. So what was he doing with them for 7 years? Well, he took them home with him. And he put them in a little box, which he kept underneath his bed. And he used to boast that he had the very bones of Annabel Lee underneath his bed. And when he had special guests over at his house, he'd invite them to come and touch the bones of Annabel Lee. And somebody eventually said that was a bad idea. You probably should not keep skeletons underneath your bed. So eventually he said that he had a dream that a raven flew into his room in the night and croaked at him. And that was his sign that Poe or Poe's ghost or the raven wanted him to finally give up the bones. So he sent them down to Baltimore, where they're buried next to her husband. And that story is what I believe makes William Fearing Gill the most fanatical of all Poe fans. So what do you think? Was William Gill the biggest Poe fan ever? Or does someone else hold claim to that title? Let us know down in the comments. And if you'd like to prove your Poe fandom, you don't have to dig up Virginia Poe's corpse. Just become a member or support the Poe Museum at poemuseum.org to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like these signed copies of William Gill's Life of Poe. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and we'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.